Hello, welcome to the AP Environmental Science. We're still on Unit 4, and this is the third part, so this is Unit 4, Part C. Starting off with a discussion about transportation infrastructure on the topic of land use and eventually some water use. I love this photograph. It shows a whole bunch of people trying to really exemplify mass transit. So, this does not appear to be a picture taken in New Jersey, probably not the United States. And people always like to say how overseas their mass transit system is so much better than that in the United States. And I guess this photograph proves that. We will start our discussion by talking about the U.S. federal highway system, and it has over 160,000 miles to it. It's a very well developed federal highway system. The interstate highways are those that do not have any traffic lights, and the president who is most often associated with this would be Eisenhower. He was a military guy who was a hero of World War II, and before that, he had noticed how transporting military troops and equipment across the nation was a pretty difficult task, and he believed that the interstate highway system would help expedite not just the movement of military stuff across the nation, but would be good for U.S. business as well. So the interstate highways do receive a lot of monetary support from the federal government, but they are actually built and owned and operated by the states of the nation. But again, they're subsidized by the federal government. There is a federal highway tax of 18 cents per gallon of gas, and it's a little bit higher for diesel fuel. And these numbers are even rounded. I think it's around 18.7 cents per gallon of gas. But anyway, the idea is that the federal government puts this tax on gasoline and diesel fuel, and then they go and they use that money and invest it in the highway system. And that's the method that the United States uses. Other nations, really, especially Europe, heavily tax gasoline to the point where in other countries, gasoline can cost up to $8 a gallon. And every nation, no matter where you are, they're paying the same price for the crude oil, and the refinery expenses aren't really that much different. But the reason for the differences is how much these governments tax the gasoline that consumers pay. So in the United States, the last bullet point there is that the major U.S. cities are served by interstates. So when they designed the interstate highways, they tried to make sure that they ran directly into U.S. cities and try to hit at least serve near the downtown areas. In Europe, when the highways with on ramps and off ramps without traffic lights were built, Europe they had to avoid the cities because there were so many more people living in the cities. It would have been pretty disruptive to build highways like that. However, in the United States, this has facilitated urban sprawl. On the other hand, it has kind of saved the economies of the U.S. cities. Now, the benefit environmentally when we talk about highways is that they reduce pollutants because cars in stop and go traffic, and these bullet points refer to the cars that are in stop and go traffic, they emit far more carbon monoxide and NOx, which is any nitrogen oxygen compound, such as NO2, N2O, NO, N2O5 even, but all these pollutants would be released in greater amounts if cars were stuck in stop and go traffic. And also the smog forming volatile organic compounds, which we will discuss in more detail later on. But by having the interstates built where cars are not stopping and getting stuck at traffic lights and things like that, these pollutants are all reduced. So in that respect, interstate highways are good for the environment. If you're stuck in traffic and stop and go traffic, you're also going to use more gasoline, and therefore you're burning more fossil fuels, which would increase the amount of greenhouse gases. And this point here about increasing foreign dependence on foreign oil, and so in general, the interstates are not just good for the economy, but also good for the environment. Further points here is that the decreased traffic improves our quality of life and also the economy. It makes it cheaper to ship products into and out of cities and also across the country. And this way, products can reach the market quickly. And it's been estimated that for every $1 invested in highways, that it actually returns $6 to the economy. And so the price that we're paying in taxes does come back 6 times as great. All right, so that's all we'll really say about highways. We also want to mention at least a little bit about canals. Canals today, shipping is still one of the most prevalent forms of moving products around, and there's still a great amount of products that move via the oceans, and especially with so much being imported from other nations. The Panama Canal is one of the world's most important waterways. It's about 48 miles. It goes through the nation of Panama, and it connects the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. Without it, the ships would have to drive all the way around South America, and so it actually cuts a great deal of time off of the travel of a ship on a shipping route, and of course that would save burning of fossil fuels, so ships do not have to burn as much fossil fuels if they can take a more direct route. Uh, Interesting stat about the Panama Canal is that every time a ship goes through, there's locks that have to open and release water, and the canal itself, although it connects two saltwater bodies, the two oceans, the Pacific and Atlantic, it's also connected to a freshwater way. And there's a lake called Gatan Lake, which was made when the canal was built. And every time a ship passes through the Panama Canal, there's 52 million gallons of fresh water that goes along with it. Other than the Panama Canal, one of the other major canals in the world is the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. So it's really connecting Europe to Asia, and it says avoiding Africa, meaning avoiding the expense and time of ships having to go all the way around the continent of Africa. So these two these two canals allow ships to take a shortcut that eliminates the need to drive around an entire continent. So the Suez Canal, you can see it's 163 miles, and of all the shipping in the world, and there is quite a bit of it, 8% of the entire world's shipping does go through the Suez Canal. So here's a quick little map of Panama. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but what I found interesting is it allows the passage of ships to go from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean by way of the Caribbean Sea. But from the Pacific side, ships actually wind up traveling slightly west just because of the shape of Panama. Here's that man-made freshwater lake that was created so that the canal could be built, and you can see it's a pretty sizable lake. But every time the locks open to let ships through, a great deal of fresh water is also released. The way that a lock works, a lock has the role of allowing ships to pass through when the sea level on one side is not the same as the sea level on the other. And the Panama Canal is a great example of that because the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean on the two sides of Panama do not have the same sea level. So this system of locks, locks have been used as long as canals have existed, even before any kind of pump was needed or anything like that. So a lock is able to be operated really without the use of any kind of machinery. And this ship, for example, assume it's going this way, will pull into the lock, and then they will shut a gate behind it and allow water to flow from the higher elevation to the lower elevation just through the normal gravity. So there may be some kind of underground pipes, or in the old days they just had a little gate in the door of these gates. They had a smaller gate that they could open and allow the water to just flow from the higher elevation into the lower elevation, and it would raise the ship up. And then when the water level was equal, they could open the other gate. Okay, off of canals and onto some of the roadless areas in the nation. These are areas where no roads have been built, and no logging or development can occur. So a lot of this is land that's owned by the federal government, and it's done as a haven for fish or wildlife, and it protects these species. And habitats in other areas may have been deeply fragmented. So there are over 1,600 threatened, endangered, or sensitive species that live in these roadless areas, and by using really some uh, very dedicated preservation, they're able to make sure that these species do not live in a fragmented ecosystem. So some of these roadless areas include watersheds that provide drinking water, and there are 60 million acres of National Forest Service lands that are protected. And really, the Forest Service, their job was to really make sure that these forests were at least managed so that the companies that take logs from them do so responsibly. But now 31% of national forest lands are actually protected, and it makes up a 2% of the total U.S. land base, and 2% is a small percent, but the total land base of the United States is a large number. So it's actually a huge amount of land that they've excluded from logging and really any kind of development, even building roads through them, because of the damage that roads could lead to as far as ecosystems. So to make sure that these habitats remain intact. So we shall now talk about some of the public and federal lands in the United States, such as national parks and even other types of preservation. Okay, federal government manages a great deal of public land. This is especially true out west when you move not just past the Mississippi, but past the middle part of the country, and you get into the far western states. And out there, a lot of the land has not been developed and is owned by the federal government, and they're not all managed by the same part of the government. And we're going to look at some of these different types of government agencies that manage the land. One is called the Bureau of Land Management, which is actually a very big part of the federal government. They manage 262 million acres, which is 1/8 of the United States. And a lot of you listening to this probably never heard of the Bureau of Land Management, even though you've heard of National Park Service or something like that. But the Bureau of Land Management manages a huge chunk of U.S. land, but most of it is out west. Uh, so besides managing the 262 million acres, they've been also charged with managing a large number of acres of subsurface mineral resources. So if there is a company that wants to go and perform some mining operations on property owned by the United States government, even if it's not within land that's overseen by the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM will be responsible for managing that mining operation. And they also provide wildfire management for 400 million acres. Most of the land is western United States, including Alaska. Um, the state of Nevada, over 80% of the land in Nevada is not developed, and it's not even owned by anybody other than the federal government. So 80% of the land in Nebraska is managed by the BLM. That's just, I said Nebraska, I meant Nevada. Nevada being a huge desert, there's not a lot of demand for that kind of land and not a lot of economic value, so nobody wants it, but it is still part of the United States ownership. So the BLM is the part of the government charged with managing it. They also manage resources such as energy, minerals, timber, fish and wildlife, and also some historic sites. There are a few laws that you should be familiar with. The Wilderness Act of 1964. This actually requires federal officials to manage wilderness areas to retain their wilderness character. So areas that have been identified as being wilderness, the federal government saw fit to make sure they remain wild, and the federal officials are now required to try to maintain that wild character. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. Many rivers have been identified as a wild and scenic river, including part of the Delaware River, for example. And this act, once a river has been Given that identification, this law will actually allow the government to take measures to preserve these rivers and keep them free flowing, as it's said. But mainly, it's to make sure that it remains a clean and good looking river. Food Security Act of 1985 discourages the conversion of wetlands to non-wetlands, and we've previously had discussions about wetlands. And usually, when wetlands were drained and converted to non-wetlands, it was for the purpose of agriculture. And the United States has since seen the error of its ways, and not only do we want to not convert any more wetlands to agriculture, it actually encourages farmers to restore former wetlands to turn them back into wetlands. A few words about the National Park Service. It's 84 million acres. A large chunk of that is in Alaska, and some of the land is even privately owned, but meaning not owned by the U.S. government, but still part of the National Park Service. The national parks are most usually associated with recreation. So the national parks, places like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, they're associated with huge amounts of tourism, and the tourism can have an impact on the land that was intended to be preserved. So people rush out there to look at the nature, but in the process are kind of harming nature. So Grand Canyon and Yellowstone especially, it's noticed that there's a lot of congestion. There's so many hikers that the trails have been eroded. The noise from traffic and campers and just clueless people that go in these places and make a lot of noise, and just normal pollution from cars. There's other threats because these are very large parcels of land. They're very difficult to manage, and off-road vehicles such as ATVs and even four-wheel drive vehicles, people going off-road, uh, very often illegally, and that causes damage to the properties. Uh, Commercial activities such as mining, logging, and grazing by animals, these are for the most part allowed on most of the government-owned land. We'll get into taking a closer look at where it's permitted and where it's not, but just because you have something that's part of the federal government, it may be designated as a national park or a national forest, but it's definitely still open to businesses to try to go in there and take lumber or minerals or perform mining, something like that. The National Wildlife Refuge, that's a designation that some land has, and that's definitely more restricted as far as what people can go in there and do. And a lot of the activities that are permitted in national parks are not permitted in wildlife refuge. They are havens for wildlife, and these were actually kind of created in response to when people started to realize the crises that were happening, potential of animals being driven to extinction in the country. So a lot of the places have this designation. There are 151 million acres, and there's over 550 sites that have this designation. Again, created in 1903 by Teddy Roosevelt, mentioned in an earlier part of this unit. Teddy Roosevelt is often associated with the wildlife refuge, given the naming of the teddy bear was after some of his actions that he took while hunting in these lands. He himself actually designated 53 areas while he was president, and now there's 550. But he definitely got things to a very good start by including very huge amounts of land, most of them out west again. It's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and even though it's a wildlife refuge, sometimes fishing is permitted, and hunting is usually allowed, not for the benefit of hunters, but if they see that there's maybe a deer population that's getting too large, then it can actually start to exclude other species. Say there's birds that live on the ground, like a pheasant, the ground nesting birds as they're called, but deer, they don't eat the birds, but they eat the shrubs that are low to the ground and would protect the nest of these birds. So they realize that as a species like deer becomes very large, it actually could expose other species to danger. So that's just one example of why hunting might be allowed. Birding, just looking at birds and other types of observation, photography, education, but also some amount of the tourism and the entertainment aspect. National forests, which we mentioned before, these are public lands set aside to grow trees, protect watersheds, produce timber, and ensure future timber supply. So a lot of this was created just to save the logging companies from themselves. So logging is allowed, but it's very carefully managed. There's 161 million acres in these national forests, a total of 8% of U.S. land, and that's a small percent of a very large amount of land. So that is a huge amount of land. The Forest Service is over 100 years old. The idea here is that they manage forests for the greatest good of the greatest number of people in the long run, and with the philosophy we should wisely and carefully use resources from public lands. So some different ideas of how U.S. land is used here, and this chart is kind of showing it as far as what's allowed on the different types of U.S. land. And National Forests and Bureau of Land Management, anything on this list is allowed. So you have recreation, which dispersed recreation and developed recreation. This is low impact recreation. The dispersed and developed recreation would be high impact recreation that requires maybe the building of roads and paved trails and things like that. Timber harvest and mining, these are both very intrusive on natural environments, but they're not excluded from National Forest or Bureau of Land Management. They are excluded from national parks and wilderness areas. Grazing, and remember the threat of overgrazing if it's not carefully monitored, that's allowed in everything except the national parks. So grazing's even allowed in wilderness areas. The federal government recognizing that there is a need to allow ranchers to let their animals graze on large expanses of land so that it does not lead to overgrazing. Wildlife management, hunting. Sorry, I got some computer issues there. Watershed management, making sure that pollution doesn't happen, but also erosion and things like that. So watersheds are managed on all of these except for the national parks. Road construction and trail construction are generally allowed, except road construction is excluded from wilderness areas. So there are different degrees of how closely the federal government will keep an eye on different activities. And the wilderness areas, they're primarily there to protect the animals, and that's why certain activities are excluded from there, but not on National Forests or Bureau of Land Management. So there's a lot on this map, but the thing that jumps out right away is that the different colors are representing the different areas that are managed by the different methods, but so much of it is out west, and this map is very colorful when you look at really the far west of the country, meaning past not just the Mississippi, but past the Midwest as well. A lot of colors there. The only thing you really see on the eastern half of the nation is some green areas, which are Forest Service. There's not really anything in New Jersey. We see a little bit up in Vermont, New Hampshire, and a little patch there in Pennsylvania. So there are some forests in the east, but you don't have Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service. They do have some smaller parks out east, the National Park Service is sort of all over the nation. But in general, and especially in Alaska, you look at Alaska and it looks, there's very few, Alaska is enormous, but most of the land is protected by one of these methods. So logging occurs on both national forests, which is the public, but also private land. And nowadays, most logging is on private land. So timber companies, they do cut from national and state forests, and you see the point there that the Forest Service manages timber sales and they build roads. But also the Forest Service, because they're so strict about the management, many companies have found all the regulations to be intrusive, and so a lot of the logging that occurs, these private companies, they just want to go on private land where they don't have to deal with as much regulation. So if you look at it, you can see that a lot of the regulations have really just pushed the logging off of public land and onto private land. The unfortunate thing is now a lot of the logging that occurs is not managed. So you don't have the management because of all the regulations, and maybe has done some harm that if the regulations weren't as stringent, then there would be more logging occurring where the government can actually regulate it. Um, so in general, the trend has been that logging on national forest land has decreased. And the last point on the left here is that regrown forests are ecologically less valuable. So when it takes actually, very many decades, maybe into the hundreds of years before a regrown forest is what it was before the logging had occurred. And there's a statement here where taxpayers actually subsidize private timber harvesting on the public land, meaning the national forest. The government builds the roads that the logging company uses, and they're kind of getting some benefits of those things at the expense of taxpayers. The National Forest Management Act of 1976. Every national forest has to have plans for renewable resource management, and you can see what's trying to be managed here: managing timber harvesting, monitoring fish and wildlife populations, allowing recreation. They certainly don't want to exclude recreation from happening here. Prohibit livestock grazing to protect historic and archaeological sites, and prohibit building of new roads. Um, so the livestock grazing, they don't want to see these lands overgrazed. They want to maintain habitats for threatened and endangered species, restore the wetlands, streams, forests, and soils, and also old growth stands, which the old growth forests are completely eliminated on the eastern half of the country, but there are still some out in, say, California, where they have redwoods that are estimated to be 2,000 years of age. Wetlands, which we've covered in great detail before. Area covered by water to support plants that can grow in water-saturated soil. Wetlands at least spend part of the year underwater. Countries with the most is the first one there is Canada. 14% of the total land of Canada is considered wetland, and also Russia is in there, but a lot of it's in Siberia where it's very cold and maybe the development demands are not as great. And Brazil with the Amazon and the rainforest, there's a lot of wetlands associated with that. And there's a stat here: wetlands once made up 10% of the United States, but now only 5%. And the vast majority, meaning of that 5%, the majority of that is in Florida and Louisiana. So the bayous and swamps of Louisiana. Florida, of course, has the Everglades, which that the reason that they didn't get developed is there's very poor soil in the Florida Everglades. So any kind of farming operations were attempted, but they failed, and eventually farmers gave up. And the good news is that these wetlands in the Everglades were preserved. 90% of the wetlands that were converted or eliminated from being wetlands are now was for the purpose of turning it into agriculture. And again, with wetlands, you have a high biodiversity, highest of any sort of ecosystem, and the high plant productivity does lead to high animal diversity. And of all the endangered species that have been identified, 1/3 of them actually spend some time, at least in the wetlands. So the way that wetlands are viewed, look at the picture here on the right. This is from an old movie, the Swamp Thing, and just kind of showing you the view that people had of swamps. They're just considered bug infested. They're disease ridden wastelands, and I think there was always sort of a feeling that man would really prove that they were superior to nature, and that anything in nature was there for man's taking. And over time, attitudes have changed. Federal policies toward wetlands have also changed. Originally, the government used to encourage draining and filling of wetlands, and here you're showing what happen. What you're seeing what happens when somebody tries to turn wetland into farm. Left with a big kind of swampy area in the middle of the farm. and I don't think you could really call it a pond. It's just really a great big puddle. But attitudes have changed. Now the federal policy is no net loss of wetlands, including subsidy and technical assistance to restore and create wetlands. The government does recognize that sometimes there's land that might be more valuable if it's developed, but if you developed wetlands, you have to go somewhere else, buy a piece of property, and convert not wetlands into wetlands so that there's no net loss. So you can develop wetlands provided somewhere else you restore an equal number of acres to wetlands that were not wetlands before. So here's a way that some development and trying to show that it's being thought out how to convert some lands into wetlands. And pre-construction, it looks like this area is actually under complete water. So by partially draining it and maybe filling it in with some land, it's going to make it into wetlands to restore that biodiversity. So here is a map. There's a lot of stuff on this map, but showing you where the wetlands are in the dark green color. And you can see along the east coast, especially down south, there's a great deal of wetlands here. And as promised, Florida has a great deal of wetlands, and the very intense green color down here, that is the Everglades. And the lighter blue, that sort of teal color, is predominantly deep water habitat. And then the green hatch is area typified by a high density of small wetlands, which is kind of flat lands that can flood easily. Maybe they don't spend the whole year underwater, but you have the change of with seasons that it might be underwater during part of the season. Very southern part of Louisiana, you see a lot of wetlands down here, the swamps, the bayou, as it's called. And in the south, much of the south used to be under more swampland. Very quickly, look at New Jersey. Very southern, a lot of green color in the south part of New Jersey. That would be the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And it's shallow, but there's underwater, underground aquifer there with estimated up to 17 trillion gallons of water there. Okay, moving on, estimated rate of wetland loss. Back in the 50s to 70s, there were a huge amount of wetlands being, and this is annual net loss. So in the 50s to 70s, you're talking about a period of 30 years that the average of every year, 458,000 acres of wetlands were lost. Into the 80s and 90s, the rate of loss was much lower. According to the federal policy, the rate of wetlands loss now should be zero. That even if wetlands are lost in one place, they have to be created in another. So attitudes have certainly changed. More recent programs and legislation provide indirect protection incentives, and some of the examples here would be the Clean Water Act, trying to restore some wetlands, the Food Security Acts of 1985 to 2000. Farm bills come up pretty often, and as a concession, sometimes these farm bills are just enormous with a lot of details in it. And so as part of that negotiation process, certain senators and congressmen will try to insert maybe environmental provisions, and in this case, preserving of wetlands. The Coastal Zone Management Act, there's no net loss policies. Executive orders, which are signed by the president, does not need congressional approval, but it's more or less directing federal agencies saying that if no net loss, meaning if wetland is lost one place, it's going to be restored somewhere else. And the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. Wetland scientists and others now recognize the value of wetlands as distinct ecosystems, highly connected with, but they're not quite aquatic systems and they're not quite terrestrial. So, example here, the terrestrial meaning land. There's an import of nutrients. You get a fluctuating water level. You'll have different types of trees coming in here. And then eventually the water does wind up in the deep water aquatic systems. And never to say where terrestrial ends and wetland begins is often difficult. So it's not like there's a line drawn in on the earth that says This is a terrestrial system, and this is wetlands. And even the difference between wetland and the typical aquatic system is not always clear. But when these lines are drawn, they have to be done scientifically. So very quickly, the terrestrial system is dry, and the deep water aquatic system is permanently flooded, whereas the wetland is intermittently, but some of them are permanently flooded. And yeah, some of the other differences here that terrestrial systems have a low to medium productivity, and the deep water aquatic systems generally have low productivity, but the wetlands can have high, but sometimes low, but they are especially important for biodiversity. Okay, so we're going to talk quickly about some land conservation options. Conserve the land using the land use ethic model. There's 10 points here, so this is pretty lengthy, but we're talking about the land use ethic, meaning the way that we should be progressing and moving forward. Number one is always to protect biodiversity, habitats, and ecology on public lands. These are lands that belong to everyone, and the nature, especially in the United States, is pretty extensive, and any kind of actions that are taken should really protect that. The user pay approach is saying that if a corporation wants to come onto public land and remove resources, then they should pay for that. And in the past, that's not always been the case, especially for mining. And so the user pay approach is saying if a company, a profit-making company comes on public lands, then they should pay for what they take. And it doesn't seem like a very strange concept. The subpoint here is saying that ecological services of trees. Trees provide oxygen for us to breathe. They reduce erosion. They provide ecosystems for a lot of different creatures. They increase the biodiversity. So somehow they have to come up with a dollar amount for that and say if you come in and take these trees, not only do you have to pay for the wood, you have to pay for the ecological services that these trees provided. Number three seems sort of obvious that if a user damages land when they're removing the logs or whatever else, then they should pay for the damages. And it seems obvious, but that hasn't always happened. Number four, adopt an uneven aged management forestry so that when a logging company is allowed on federal lands, they don't just take the tallest trees. They're going to take some of the tall trees, some of the medium trees, and some of the small trees to make sure that the distribution is not affected. Number five, stop building so many roads because this can partition the nature. Number six, fallen trees, like dead trees that have fallen over and also dead trees that are still standing, let them be because they actually provide for wildlife habitat, and that is part of an ecosystem, and they should be left there. Number seven, just growing timber on longer rotations. Number eight, eliminating or at least reducing clear cutting, which whereas every tree is just cut down. And seed tree cutting is very similar to clear cutting, but on sloped land, because when you clear cut, erosion can be increased. So if you have a hill, sloped land is always more vulnerable to erosion. So clear cutting should not be allowed on sloped land. Rely on sustainable tree cutting, such as selective, meaning whereas the feds will tell you which trees to take, some of the big ones, some of the middle, and some of the small, and strip cutting where you're not clear cutting, and also to reduce fragmentation of the few remaining large forests. And quickly, I'll just go over a couple of vocabulary words. Remediation is the removal of pollution. This is after land has been polluted that somebody will go in, usually a private contractor, and somehow remove the contaminants from the environment, whether it's in water, air, or soil. And this is for the purpose of protecting human health. Mitigation is to moderate a condition or a force. In this example, they're showing some netting being placed on a slope, and this is not going to remediate. Remediate is where you're restoring, you're removing a pollutant or something like that. This is designed to lessen the erosion, and the word mitigate means to lessen. So mitigation occurs, you're lessening an impact before it happens. When you remediate, the damage has been done and you're trying to go and fix that. And then restoration is where they're trying to return land to the original condition before that impact actually happened. Okay, that's the end of this part of Unit 4. This is part 4C. And so next time we'll talk in more detail about things like mining and fishing. So at this point, you are ready to take quiz 4C, and I wish you luck on that, and we'll see you again. Goodbye.